Hello everyone, Just Podcast TV is here. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified on new contents.
James picked up the phone, looking at the older men watching him. He felt very relaxed. Hello? Hello, friend, a gruff-sounding man said. I want you to listen to someone first. A hoarse voice came on. James, don't come. Leave quickly. Don't stay in Reykjavik anymore. They will find... Winston's words cut out. James heard a loud crash and what sounded like a scuffle. Ah! Winston screamed but yelled. They're planning something for you. A commotion and the sound of furniture breaking came through the phone, and at the same time, Winston screamed again. He had obviously not followed their instructions. James winced at the sounds of punching. The group leaned forward as one, wanting to know what was happening. Winston's moans came through the phone as it was picked up. The man in charge said, Did you hear that? Your friend Winston is in my hands. If you don't bring the red zircon to Mount Esja 10 kilometers north of the city before midnight, well, let's just say that tomorrow, you will see his corpse lying on a street in Reykjavik. Do you understand? Do not try to call the police because I'll know their movements. If you do that, even if you brought $10 billion, you'll not be able to save your friend. The caller hung up. James glared at the phone, angry because the kidnapper had actually beaten his friend. He hadn't even given James a chance to say anything. Now he still didn't know anything else about this gang. It made him nervous. It was up to Wiley and his group to fill in the blanks. Looking at his watch, he noted it was 9:30 p.m. There were still 2.5 hours until midnight, which didn't leave much time to learn about these kidnappers. Wiley tapped his hand on his knee and asked, Well, what did they say? The situation isn't good. James did not elaborate too much. He looked at the elderly men. I need to ask you a few questions. I need answers quickly as we have little time. Okay. They had all once been part of the underworld, so they understood the urgency. James asked, What organization is Sean part of now? Are they very large? Sam rubbed his head. I'm not too sure about the details, but I think I heard someone mention it last time. He is currently part of an underground organization called Hekla Gate. James asked, Hekla Gate? Harold added, They are currently the largest underground organization in Iceland. Actually, they're in charge of laundering money for some officials. That's why they have a very strong backer. I can only think they got mixed up in abduction due to something one of these bigwigs wants. One last question. How are their weapons compared to your arsenal? It's hard to tell, but there's one thing worth noting. A while ago, a local tycoon from Iceland was shot by a sniper while he was at home. There wasn't much left of his head. There's a rumor that it was someone from Hekla, so they may have a few good marksmen. James said, All right, that's good to know. He stood up and said to Wiley, I have no more questions. You and the others should stay here. I promise to bring Winston back safely before dawn. What? You want to go alone? Lars frowned at James. Hearing that James still planned the same lone wolf rescue, Iron Tower stood up and blocked his way. No! James moved quickly, using his special skills to lift the towering man and move him out of the way. Iron Tower looked momentarily puzzled, then his mouth dropped open. It had happened so fast. Everyone stared at James, their eyes wide at what they had just witnessed. James had moved so calmly, not straining when lifting the large man. It looked like the elderly men finally understood that this young man was actually a highly trained professional. Then James said to them, Gentlemen, I'm aware that your hot blood hasn't cooled down yet despite your years. However, you have to admit that you are older now and your reflexes will be slower. If I bring you along to save Winston, it will only slow me down. The men looked at their feet, completely silent. He saw they were unwilling to admit that they were no longer the young men of yesterday, but they knew they couldn't keep up with James. He turned toward the door. Wait, James, Wiley called out. He walked over and laid a hand on James's arm and said, Take me with you. James stood speechless, thinking, Why can't you listen, old man? I just pacified your friends. Now we're back to square one. Before James could say anything, Wiley looked James in the eyes and said, If I don't do this, I will have let my son down, and for the rest of my life I will never be able to forgive myself. I don't want him to live a life of servitude or die because of something that is my fault. I actually knew long ago that he was a man with courage. It was only because I was too strict with him from the time he was a little boy. He has always obeyed my many rules. I didn't think that this would happen and harm him. I don't want my son to hate me. You have to take me with you. Wiley nearly begged James. The old man's tone was very sincere. Seeing Wiley say this, Sam immediately stood behind him and said, "James, we are all at this age of wisdom. We have lived good, long lives. Even if something unexpected happens, we will be content to know we tried our best. So you must let us join you, and we will go with you as well." Kareem also added, "Yes, that's right. What is there to be afraid of for our old bones? We know how to handle ourselves." James felt a little awkward with these old guys staring so intently at him. It was not easy to refuse, but agreeing meant that he was looking for trouble. They could end up in danger. Besides, Winston and then he'd be obligated to save them as well. He was in a dilemma. After a moment of thinking, he asked, "But what about Sarah and the others?" He hoped this would change the old man's mind. However, Wiley smiled and said, "There is a secure shelter under my house. Not only can they put it into lockdown, but it has resources inside that will allow them to live safely for a month if it comes to that." James did not expect Wiley to have such a ready facility. They made it difficult for him to say no. He nodded. "All right, then let's get going." Wiley took care of the arrangements, making sure his family knew what to do. Then the group of people squeezed into James' car, and he drove directly to Mount Esja, north of the city. The group took out their guns and rifles as James drove, checking them over and ensuring everything was in working order. They had treasured these weapons for many years and were ready for another fight. It made James feel like he was bringing a group of young kids to do a big job. They might be old soldiers, but these elderly men had the determination and passion of young lions. 10 kilometers north of the city, Mount Esja. It was a rugged valley with complex terrain. In the darkness of night, the towering stony plateau looked like behemoths crawling on the ground. James drove quickly. When he was still some distance away from the meeting point, he stopped the car. After turning off the engine, James said to Wiley and the others, "It's best if you remain a hidden contingency. If you get out here and walk over to the edge of the plateau, you should have a good view of the area. I'll then go up the road alone and meet them. When I see the layout, I'll think of a way to find out where they have Winston and adapt to the situation. After you guys are in place, you'll be able to ambush them once I have Winston. That's the most critical moment to deal the fatal blow." As James finished speaking, Wiley crossed his arms and firmly said, "Absolutely not." James was somewhat puzzled, thinking, what were they resisting now? Why not? "Because it's too dangerous. If there is a sniper targeting you, what will you do? He'll take you out before you can blink. So let me show myself instead." James grinned and said, No. I understand you're willing to sacrifice to save your son, but this group called me, and it's me they want, to deliver the red zircon to them. If you were in their shoes, it would arouse their suspicion if someone else showed up. They'd know I was lying in wait. It would make things even more complicated. But you don't have to worry. You've seen my skills. Ordinary snipers can't lock onto me, so just follow my lead. I guarantee there won't be any danger." Wiley pondered silently. The men watched him closely, gauging his reaction. They'd follow along on whatever he decided, and they'd all seen James' demonstration of prowess. Wiley accepted this, and they all got out of the car to hide in the darkness. James made sure they were okay, then continued driving. When he arrived near the rocky outpost, his phone rang. It was the same number. He shut off the engine. The same gruff voice spoke. "Get out of the car. Bring everything and keep walking forward. Don't play any tricks or I will blow your head off." James was in the enemy's line of sight. He complied and opened the car door. As soon as he exited the car, a sharp pain stabbed him between his eyes. This was his body warning him that someone had locked onto him with a rifle. He raised his hands, indicating that he had no weapons, and continued walking slowly forward. His phone rang again. The voice told him to continue walking and make no sudden moves. James passed through a narrow crevice and entered a relatively flat plain in the valley. Many strange cylindrical pillars of rock dotted the ground around him. As he stood there, James felt more than 10 painful jabs. He knew there were at least a dozen guns surrounding him. A tall man suddenly appeared on a stone ledge to James's right and shouted, "Hey, take out the crystal and show it to me now." Feeling in control, James turned to look at him and grinned. "I naturally brought what you demanded, but you have to let me see my friend first. After I know that he's safe and unhurt, I will give it to you." The man rubbed his mouth and seemed taken aback by James's aplomb. "Do you think you have the right to negotiate with me now?" He laughed coldly. As he spoke, he waved his hand, and then people hiding behind the stone pillars revealed themselves. Then the man said, "Mr. Tucker, do you understand the situation now? You don't have the right to negotiate with me." However, James's expression did not change when he faced the gangsters who surrounded him. He just smiled without humor and laughed. "My friend, if you think that under such circumstances I would bring the red zircon to you, then how stupid do you think I am?" The man laughed and clapped his hands. "Good, you are very good." He gave James a thumbs up. James dropped his joking manner. "So now I have the capital to negotiate with you." He did not care whether the kidnapper replied. "If I can't see my friend, then you won't be able to get that red zircon. Killing me guarantees that you will never find its whereabouts." The leader frowned and gestured for a subordinate to bring Winston out from behind a thick stone pillar. He pointed at Winston and said, "Oh, he's right here." James looked over to Winston, who was bound with sturdy ropes. A rag was stuffed in his mouth. He looked very miserable, bruised and bloodied, but he was still relatively healthy. The leader on the stone ledge said, "You saw him. Now it's time to take out the crystal." James grinned and said, "Of course." As he talked, he had been observing the surrounding terrain and everyone's position. They stood confidently, but most looked unprepared for any battle. If he fought them, these guys would not be able to withstand a single blow. But there must be a sniper somewhere. However, the main problem was how to save Winston. If it weren't for his safety, James would have attacked already. Just as he was planning an escape route, gunshots suddenly sounded from all directions. Iron Tower Kareem's yelled, "James, we are here to save Winston. Leave the rest to us." The leader immediately leapt down from the ledge, disappearing behind it. Wiley appeared with his old gang, catching most of the kidnappers off guard. James grinned. "I really didn't expect those old guys to be here at the critical moment." As the thugs heard the shots, they ducked behind the pillars and fired, aiming at James and into the darkness. However, these guys had been more for show and had only used their guns to intimidate others. Their shooting skills were evident as their bullets flew wide, and they had no strategic formation. James easily dodged the bullets flying towards him. Then, like a fierce tiger, he pounced in Winston's direction. Hecla Gate was nothing more than a sham, and with the unexpected assault by Wiley and his old buddies, the gang was utterly routed. James seized the opportunity, and while unarmed, he was extremely fast. The kidnappers had not realized what was going on. James was 10 meters away from the two men who held Winston, but he knocked them out with just his fists in the blink of an eye. Taking a sharp knife from his belt, with precision he cut the rope that bound Winston. Then he put away the knife and grabbed a gun from an unconscious man. Winston unwound himself from the rope. He ripped off the gag and yelled at James, "Didn't I tell you not to come? They are looking for you. They want to get the red zircon, don't you understand?" Winston's caring nature and heart of gold shone at this moment. James found it so charming. Wiley had admitted that he wasn't correct in saying his son had no courage. James grinned and said, "You look really handsome like this." His irreverent words stopped Winston for a moment. "I'm not joking. It is very dangerous for you to do this. They may have a backup." James smiled again. It's because I know how dangerous it was that I chose to come, and because I don't want to lose a friend like you." More gunshots rang out when a few remaining men from Heklagate fired wildly at James and Winston from behind a stone pillar. James leapt high and grabbed Winston, then threw him behind another pillar. Bullets hit the stones besides James. Sparks flared from the chipped rock and burned his face. James rolled to the side, raising the gun for a counterattack. He shot blindly, relying on that extended sense he had with any gun. A kidnapper screamed as a bullet hit his shoulder and knocked him to the ground. Another fell silently. James took the opportunity to dodge to the right and hide behind another stone pillar. He looked at Winston, who held his head with both hands and then grinned. "Winston, I think now is not the time for us to discuss this matter." He threw the gun across the open space to Winston. "Take it." Winston caught the gun. His eyes instantly lit up. However, that blaze was extinguished very quickly. James saw Winston's concerns in a glance and immediately said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you. Your father said that he was sorry he has set so many rules to restrict your nature. It won't happen again. He only wants you to be yourself." James disappeared behind the stone pillar in a flash. The fire in Winston's eyes burned again after he heard James's words. He skillfully pulled the safety on the gun and jumped up. He moved like a cheetah, quickly running between the rocks. He had turned from prey to a ferocious hunter. Although the Heklagate gang had superior firepower, they lacked the skills against men like James and Winston and Wiley's gang. The battle ended very quickly. When they finally finished dealing with the assailants, James and Winston joined the others where Iron Tower Kareem trained his gun on 2 men. James saw that one of them was Sean and the other was the brawny man who had sneeringly ordered James to hand over the crystal. He looked wild and unruly and refused to kneel when Iron Tower ordered him to do so. Not only did he not kneel, but he also laughed. "What fools you are! Do you know who I am? I am the boss of Heklagate. Do you think the big shots above me will let you off if you kill me?" Before he could say any more, Winston, who was beside him, smashed his face with the rifle butt. Blood flowed from the wound as he spit out several teeth. You will all die a horrible death." Winston showed no mercy. He once again thrust the rifle butt into the man's face. This time the boss did not speak. All he could do was clasp his broken face and weep as blood pooled into his hands. Winston said calmly, "It's finally fucking quiet." Looking at the cruelty Winston had meted out to the Heklagate leader, the old man smiled, as if understanding that this son of his was not inhumane, but that a tiger in his heart had been unleashed in the face of clear danger. However, to not disappoint his father, Winston had kept that tiger caged for many years. Seeing the shy smile on the face of his father, Winston turned to look at him and said, "Father, why are you here?" Wiley hesitated to speak. In the end, he only said, that it's good that you're all right." Winston nodded, frowning a bit. At that moment, Iron Tower walked up to Winston and patted him on the shoulder. "Ah, this must be Winston. Good. He has a strong personality. I like him." Wiley's old friends did not know Winston, so this was their first introduction. Before Kareem could say anything more, Sam walked over, giving Winston the once-over, and said, "Not bad indeed. Your actions look very much like Wiley's style back in the day." Right. He is even more decisive than Big Brother when it comes to life and death matters." Lars rubbed his hand, smiling. Harold also walked over and looked Winston up and down. "A chip off the old block." Winston had never seen these men before and didn't know that his father was once a gang boss, so he looked a little confused. "Who are you guys?" Wiley finally mustered up his courage. He walked over and said, "Son, I'm sorry." At the old man's sudden apology, Winston looked from him to James and back again. He didn't know what to say. Wiley looked at Winston and continued, "Son, I was once a leader of an organization." Then he told Winston about his past. Wiley's eyes glimmered with emotion as he revealed the secrets he had kept from his son. After, he grasped Winston's hand and said, "Can you forgive a father's selfishness for keeping you safe and in the dark for so long?" Everyone looked on expectantly, waiting for Winston's answer. Wiley hunched his shoulders as if expecting a blow. He had never lowered his head in front of outsiders in his life. But now, in front of his son, he had humility. Winston gave his father a big hug and grinned. "Father, you have always been a good parent in my heart. Really, you are very good." For a moment, Wiley trembled a little, seeming to doubt his ears as he raised his hands. "Really?" Winston placed his hands on Wiley's shoulders and said, "Of course. You're the best father. If it were me, I believe I would have chosen to not let my children get involved in such a life either." Wiley finally smiled happily. He hugged his son. His old gang smiled and clapped each other on the back. "What a good son." After they hugged, Wiley said to Winston, "Perhaps I was wrong in the past. I shouldn't have restrained your nature like this, and even more to not prepare you for the eventuality of my past coming back to haunt me. For years you followed my rules and you endured a lot of humiliation. That's my fault." Wiley shook his head. "I thought that this world would become a better place, but darkness and evil don't change because of the passage of time. So fuck the rules. From today onwards, my bullshit will no longer restrict you. You can be yourself and not have to live up to what I want you to be." Winston grinned and said, "Sounds good to me." The men laughed. Winston was then introduced properly to his dad's old gang. Then he asked, "How did you suddenly appear here with these guys?" Winston's question had been James's as well. He'd left them several miles back. How had they moved so quickly? Wiley explained how they became worried when Winston didn't appear for dinner and James was at the house. James added in his part, and then the Brotherhood talked over each other as they each gave their versions of how they had helped. It turned into a bit of a game until Wiley held up his hand. However, Wiley continued, winking at James. "James here didn't know that Mount Esja used to be our stronghold where we lived when we were active. It was like we were coming home. This was our natural battleground. We know it very well." Harold chuckled. "There happens to be a secret passage that led directly to this location. These guys were sitting ducks. It allowed us to catch their sniper unawares." James said admiringly, "You guys are really awesome." He gave a thumbs up to Wiley and his brothers. Wiley acceded. "If it wasn't for you, my friend, it would have been impossible to save Winston with just a few of us old guys. You were right that we are a bit slower now." James quickly shook his head and said, "As I said, this situation started because of me. This was the right thing to do, but without your help, this would have been a much more precarious situation." At that, everyone looked at the wiry, weaselly Sean and the man whose mouth had been smashed. Sean was so scared that he trembled. He quickly knelt on the ground and said repeatedly to Wiley, "I was wrong. I was wrong. Please spare me. I didn't know he was your son." Iron Tower shook his head. "Sean always was just a scared rat.